Welcome, everybody. It's past 7 o'clock, so why don't we get started? I'd like to thank you all for coming. It's really encouraging to see so many people here and so many people excited to be here. So I appreciate it. Whether it's not at you, always makes it all the more wonderful that you're here and that you took the time to come. Quick reminder, I just looked at Professor Brown, so this makes me think of it. If you're in his class, there's a sign-up sheet that's outside. Please make sure to sign up on that when you get on your way out. For everybody else, I'd like to welcome you. This is a talk that's hosted by the Applied Ethics Institute here, obviously at Utica College. The Institute is one that attempts to engage in discussions concerning ethical issues that arise in society that are of import to people in society. We try not to engage solely in philosophical discussion, but we intend to address public issues in a philosophical way, through a philosophical lens, and to bring light to them the best that we can, and to encourage a critical discussion of these issues to the best of our ability. I would be remiss not to mention that if you are interested in issues such as this, we do discuss these sorts of things in the philosophy department often, and we have a philosophy of justice minor in particular where these sorts of issues are discussed regularly. Anybody in the department or myself would be interested in having a further conversation with you about that. So the way that this is going to go tonight is Professor Wilson will speak for approximately an hour, probably a little bit shy of that, and then we'll open up to the floor and we will allow you the opportunity to ask questions. I will ask that you ask them as loudly and as clearly as possible because we are taping this today. So it's going to appear much better if Professor Wilson is responding to a question that the audience can hear on the video rather than simply responding to a question that we can't hear. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our speaker to you today. Professor Wilson is an assistant professor of philosophy at Howard University in D.C. She completed her PhD at University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, which, for those of you who don't know the philosophy rankings of departments, assuming that's essentially all of you, it's an incredibly good philosophy school, and it's an honor to have her here today. She received her bachelor's and master's degree from Howard University. She's had prior academic appointments at Duke University in Durham, North Carolina, and her research interests are varied, but they do include bioethics, feminist theory, and race theory, and she's originally from Albany, Georgia. So please join me in welcoming her here this evening.
Good evening, everybody.
Good evening.
I am so honored and happy to see so many people here, and a little unnerved by seeing so many people here. So I'm glad that you came out, and I hope that our discussion is useful. It's kind of pitched to be more interdisciplinary, and what else should I say about this talk? I got mine. It's supposed to be more interdisciplinary, and I would also say a lot of my thoughts on this matter are preliminary. So they're not fully fleshed out. I've been thinking about, I think about a lot of issues around bias and discrimination a lot just as part of my, what did you just do? It's really good. It's fine. Okay. So I think about issues of bias and discrimination a lot just in my regular work, but I've been thinking a lot in the last year in particular about how police interact with citizenry. And I've been trying to figure out a way to think philosophically about this question, given that it's personally important to me, right? It's something that I just care about as a human being living in the world. But as an academic philosopher, I want to, and as a scholar, I want to try to figure out how to include these kinds of ideas in my intellectual work. So in my teaching, I actually taught a class last semester. I reshaped my intro to philosophy class last semester to think specifically about purposing. And I don't know how much you all know about Howard University in Washington, D.C., but Howard is a historically black institution. And it has a very strong tradition of social justice and activism. In fact, Thurgood Marshall, who was the first African-American Supreme Court Justice, is a Howardite, and he was on the case that he actually argued Brown versus the Board of Education for the Supreme Court. So, we have this long legacy. Stokely Carmichael, who became Kwame Ture, was a philosophy major, graduated from Howard University. So, we have this really long tradition of kind of activism and participation, and last semester, our students were going just about every weekend after Ferguson just to participate in protests and to engage in voter registration drives. And so it made sense to me, being in that institution in particular, to think about philosophy and what philosophy and philosophers might have to say about our role in the world. All right, so let me get started. The title of this talk is Second Order Discrimination and Implicit Bias. And it's going to feel like I'm jumping around a lot. It's not going to end up neatly. And some of it is because it's preliminary, and then some of it is because these are just not neat issues, and I'm trying to grapple with them from different standpoints. So hopefully during the Q&A, there'll be opportunity for us to engage in a little bit more exchange and maybe some clarification. And maybe you all can help me think about these things a little bit more clearly. Okay, get started. My task for tonight's remarks is to think about philosophical work on discrimination in light of recent controversial instances of police-citizen interaction. Or to put it plainly, what might a philosopher have to say about recent instances of police officers killing unarmed citizens without penalty? I've been thinking about these issues, and despite my best efforts, I'm sorry to report that I do not have any neat answers to the problem. I'm not even sure exactly what the problem is, which in my book makes recent events ripe for philosophical inquiry, as many legitimate philosophical endeavors involve attempting to clarify a problem. I could say that the problem is when black folks, citizens, have cause to interact with the police, they are more likely to end up unnecessarily humiliated, seriously injured, or dead than whites who have cause to interact with the police. This seems to be the case regardless of the race of the officer, and I think that's important to talk about, because I think a lot of the kind of popular media discussion is around, racist white cops killing poor unarmed black citizens, and unfortunately, black cops kill black citizens, unarmed black citizens, too, at much higher rates than unarmed white citizens are killed. It's also important to acknowledge, I want to just say this because I don't want you to think I'm kind of stacking the deck in favor of an argument that I'm trying to make. The data regarding officer-involved shootings is not complete because it's reported voluntarily through the Uniform Crime Reporting Program. So the FBI Director, James Comey, acknowledged this in his February 12th remarks. So he made some remarks pretty recently, February 12th, 2015, at Georgetown, actually, where he talks about bias in policing. He acknowledges that it exists, which is sort of a radical move for not just a police officer or a law enforcement officer, but for the person who's in charge of the FBI. So that was newsworthy. I don't know if any of you heard it, but there's that. So is this problem, right, this problem of how police and some citizens in the population interact, is this a problem in itself, or is this a symptom of a larger problem? My intuition, and it's going to, my intuition is going to require further development than we have time for in our time together this evening. But my intuition is that the or in this case is inclusive. In other words, it's both. It's both a problem in itself, and it's also a symptom of a larger problem. It is important to talk about the role of discrimination in these interactions, and a good chunk of my remarks will be an attempt to clarify the form and nature of the discrimination at play. At the same time, there seems to be a prior question that political philosophers seem particularly suited to address. That is the question of political authority. It is taken for granted among political philosophers that a minimal requirement for a legitimate government is that the governed consent to be governed. So this idea of government by consent to be governed. But philosophers still puzzle over questions regarding what it means to properly be said to have consented to be governed, and further, what follows from having consented. How one answers these questions and how one thinks about these questions will influence what one thinks of citizens' obligations to government and its agents, and what one thinks the government's obligations are to its citizens and its residents, right? I mean, so I'm going to use the language of citizenship a lot, because a lot of the political philosophy literature is around citizenship and invokes citizenship. But to be clear, the idea of citizenship isn't neutral. And there are many people who live within our geographic confines who aren't citizens, right? And so, you know, it's not just worth, I think it's important to ask the question of whether residents should have some of the same considerations as citizens, at least in kind of basic day-to-day interactions with agents of the state, like police officers, or whether there are certain kinds of treatments that are reserved for citizens, right? I mean, so the language of citizenship, even though that's the language I'm going to use, I want to be very clear that that's not where the conversation stops for me. And that I don't want us to ignore the reality that there are a lot of people, for whatever reason, who aren't citizens, whether they're here legally or not, who aren't citizens of our geographic confines, right? Okay. So here's going to be a brief roadmap. I'm going to start with two historical accounts of political authority, the emergence of political authority. So one is going to be Hobbes, one is going to be Locke. You know, they provide a nice counterbalance for one another. And I'm going to give a kind of simplified version of the story, but just enough of the story to get us off the ground so that we can have a conversation. I'll show how these different conceptions, right, so how Hobbes' conception versus Locke's conception of the origins of civil society leads to different conclusions about the role of governments in society and the obligations imposed on the citizenry as a result. 2. Using Adrian Piper's classic work on second-order discrimination as instructive, I will show how discriminatory beliefs color interactions between citizens and police as agents of the government, right? So police aren't just kind of random citizens who roam the streets with guns, right? I mean, they act as agents of the government, right? They're vested with some sort of authority to do what they do, for good or for bad. 3, I will briefly consider another kind of case that may be less inflammatory. I don't know, maybe it will be, but the case of resume bias. I opt to talk about resume bias because the process of job seeking or hiring candidates will directly affect nearly all of us in ways that police-citizen interaction might not. Yet similar forms of discrimination exist, albeit generally carried out by agents of the state. 4, I'll offer some preliminary thoughts on what we can take away from this discussion. So what's going to be the upshot? All right. So political authority. The dominant view of political authority that has emerged in the West is that of political legitimacy through consent. Early modern philosophers regularly made use of the state of nature in order to show not only how humans transition from a condition without law into civil society, but also why such a transition occurred. right? So there's a how question, right? How did it happen that we went from all just roaming around in the forest or the woods or the jungle or the Arctic tundra or wherever people were, right, into having ordered society? How did that happen? And then the second question that they address is why did it happen, right? Why weren't we just fine hanging out in the jungle and eating coconuts or hanging out in the Arctic tundra and eating whatever one eats in the Arctic tundra? I guess you got ice fish or something. Whatever you do up there, right? Why don't we find just doing that, right? Why do we feel the need to make this transition into civil society, into a society that has, organized laws? Whereas the state of nature was often a thought experiment or a rhetorical device, some political philosophers thought of the state of nature as an actual historical state of humans, and in some cases, a then current state of savages, right? So you have all these Enlightenment philosophers, some making claims that, well, even though we're civilized over here in Europe, you can actually find something that looks kind of like the state of nature. If you go down to the South Sea Islands, or if you go over to the Americas, all these savage brown people are still running around not having law. Okay. In Thomas Hobbes' famous Leviathan, 1651, he describes life in a state of nature as nasty, brutish, and short, right? So people who've never read the Leviathan can tell you that Thomas Hobbes describes the state of nature as nasty, brutish, and short. The state of nature is a state of war in which humans, when not actively fighting one another, still exhibit a heightened propensity to fight, whether as a result of glory-seeking or diffidence. So there are people who are going to run around fighting because that's just what they want to do. There are people who would be fine to be left alone, but given that everybody else is fighting, they have to defend themselves. People cannot trust one another, which makes alliances few and fleeting, right? So we're under this dramatic condition of scarcity and people can't be trusted. We can talk more about this if you're interested in it, but that's kind of the rough idea. Mere survival is a preoccupation for everyone, and as a result, no one can flourish. There's no room for art or creative contemplation. It is against these background conditions that humans come together and decide to form a government. And because life in the state of nature is so horrific, the people are willing to subordinate their own authority and contract with one another to abide by the will of a sovereign. The sovereign has absolute power and makes no such reciprocal contract with the people, right? So the people contract with one another and say, okay, we're going to listen to a sovereign. The sovereign doesn't, in turn, contract with the people and promise them a whole lot, more than maybe organization and protection. The sovereign, so for Hobbes, if the sovereign has to answer to the people, right, or contract with the people in any kind of meaningful way, then the sovereign is not really in charge, right? So part of what it means to be in charge is to be in charge absolutely. As an interesting aside, this is completely off topic, but I think this idea of the person in charge has to be in charge absolutely. We even see in the United States in a famous case known as State v. Mann, decided by Chief Justice Ruffin, who was the Chief Justice of the North Carolina Supreme Court. And in this case, just very briefly, an enslaved woman is hired out. And during the course of her hiring out, she attempts to escape. And there's discussion about whether, and she's in turn shot by the slave, well, he's not her slave owner, slave renter, who is acting as her master at the time, her owner at the time. And so there's a question about what kind of penalty, if any, this guy should suffer for shooting this enslaved woman who, while officially not his property, is functioning as his de facto property at the time. And Judge Ruffin says, right, look, if you're gonna have slavery and we're gonna allow slave owners to rent out their slaves to other people and allow, other people to become de facto masters, even though they're not owners, then we have to have this system. And a slave owner, or slave master, even temporarily, if he's gonna exist, he has to have absolute power and authority, right? He can't have kind of shaky, suspicious power that other people can challenge, right? So if we're gonna have it, if you're gonna have absolute power, you're gonna have absolute power. Otherwise, you're not really a master. So that's completely an aside, and it's a very shortened version, and there are a lot more nuances to the story, but that's a rough idea from Judge Ruffin. And so Hobbes takes a similar view about general political authority, right? You're gonna have, either you're gonna have a sovereign who's in charge of stuff, or you're not. There's no two ways about that. All right. So the one exception that, right, so if the people, okay, that's right. So for Hobbes, if the people could manage themselves efficiently, then they wouldn't be crying to a sovereign about leaving a state of nature and having a civil society. So clearly, people can't manage themselves efficiently. This is why we have a sovereign. So the one exception that Hobbes offers, or that he allows to continue even in civil society, is the idea of immediate self-defense. Right? So if the sovereign immediately puts your life in danger, you do have a right to defend yourself. You never abdicate your right to defend your own life. So for Hobbes, once we consent to the government, we're obligated to obey. That's just what we're supposed to do. So John Locke does not paint nearly as bleak a picture of the state of nature in the second treatise. In Locke's second treatise, people are in a state of perfect freedom relative to one another. However, the law of nature still constrains behavior. So you have this kind of, I'm going to be careful with like, God-like law that still kind of exists even when people aren't operating in a society. Kind of tells you right from wrong, the kinds of things that you're not supposed to do. And we can't adjudicate our own disputes. So life isn't nasty, brutish, and short, right? It's not terrible in the way that Hobbes' state of nature is. And it's, compared to Hobbes, it's a relatively peaceful way to be, but it's a little disorganized, right? So we need somebody to kind of come, get us all together and provide some leadership and adjudicate our disputes, right? Because this is one thing that Locke cares about. We care that our disputes with one another are adjudicated fairly, but also to protect property. This is going to be really important for Locke. And for Locke, property isn't just stuff you own, you also own property in your own body. This is going to be really important. So political authority is legitimate insofar as it protects these rights, and to the extent that it fails, the people have a right, perhaps even an obligation, to rebel and create a government that better suits the needs of the people. So we have two very different conceptions, not only of how civil society comes to be, but also what follows from that. For Hobbes, the state can and does demand complete obedience. For Locke, the state exists to serve the people and can be dissolved if and when it fails to do so. These different ideas about the nature of the state and the corresponding obligations of the citizen have not been resolved. Given that police officers are agents of the state, these different ideas also manifest themselves in differing beliefs about what police officers are allowed to do and how citizens should behave during police-citizen interactions. One with a more Hobbesian view of the state might argue that citizens are obligated to obey the police no matter what, even when the police are wrong. However, for a certain stripe of Hobbesian, right, the police are never going to be wrong per se, right? Because what the police can do is we've already contracted that they can make laws. For Lockean, a police authority is not absolute, and one is well within one's right to resist perceived police intrusion. Furthermore, the social contract tradition itself is not without critique. Charles Mills argues in The Racial Contract that far from being an oversight to be ignored in favor of the universal or abstract nature of political philosophy, after all, philosophers will say that the arguments are what's most important, right? Not these little historical details. Race plays a fundamental, if largely invisible, role in the formulation of civil society. And we can talk about this part some more in the Q&A. I mean, I'm not going to go into a long discussion about Mills's book in The Racial Contract, but if you're interested in it, I think it's a really good read. Far from a mere thought experiment, the social contract reflects clear historical moments in the formation of modern society. His idea is that the social contract is in actuality an agreement between whites, and thus the long history of slavery, genocide, colonialism, and discrimination are not historical accidents, but the result of deliberate decisions. Likewise, Carol Pateman argues in The Sexual Contract that the social contract is an agreement between men to limit the political rights of women. So there are all these kinds of critiques of how how we thought about the social contract historically. I'm going to move on from that to second order discrimination. Despite his dim view of the historical foundation of civil society, Mills would most likely agree that in polite company, you would not find many people who are willing to defend slavery, genocide, colonialism, right, or its historical justifications in polite company. Adrienne Piper contrasts what she terms first and second order discrimination. First order discrimination is what we ordinarily understand by the term discrimination in political contexts, a manifest attitude in which a particular attribute of a person that is irrelevant to judgments of that person's non-instrumental value or competence. In other words, judging people unfairly on criteria that aren't relevant to who they are. Put that in plain English. That was a little better, wasn't it, than what she said. Overt racist discrimination would be an example of first order discrimination. Second order discrimination is the attitude within which primary disvalued attributes in turn confers disvalue respectively on further attributes of the disvaluee. So let me give you an example of that to understand. Let us imagine a would-be second order discriminator whose recipient is women. The second order discriminator finds himself in a professional circle that includes a woman who is smart and capable. That was clip art. I had nothing to write down. Right. Yet the second order discriminator takes her intellectual prowess as pushiness or aggressiveness, despite the fact that her behavior falls squarely within the accepted practices of their professional circle. The second order discriminator need not harbor any overt hostility towards women in general or towards the particular woman in his professional circle. In fact, on Piper's account, second order discrimination works just as well in those who don't hold the kind of animus held by first order discriminators. She goes so far to describe it as peculiarly the sickness of thoughtful, well-intentioned, and conscientious individuals who nevertheless have failed adequately to confront and work through their own prejudices, or perhaps have been too quickly satisfied by their ability to marshal arguments on behalf of doing so. So we'll talk about that in a second too. So while first order discriminators will almost always also be second order discriminators, second order discriminators will not necessarily also be first order discriminators. The second order discriminator is also different from the stereotyper. For the stereotyper, some arbitrary attribute is falsely taken to be characteristic of a person of a particular race or ethnic or religious affiliation. For example, one might think that all Irish people are drunks or that all Muslims are terrorists. Meanwhile, the second order discriminator evaluates some attribute that may be in itself positive or at least neutral as negative when that attribute manifests itself in one who is disvalued by reason of some primary attribute. To return to the woman in the second order discriminator professional circle, far from being lauded for her intellectual ability by the second order discriminator, the woman is instead castigated for a trait that would be regarded as positive were she a man, right? So now she's smart and she's capable and she's pushy, right? Whereas if she were a man, the second order discriminator would not regard her trait of intellectual prowess as negative. The second order discriminator may willingly confess that he finds his colleagues' pushiness off-putting. However, the real problem is not her pushiness, but her womanness. Even if he cannot bring himself to admit that this is a real problem, and even if he's not consciously aware that this is the actual problem. The idea that one may not be aware of one's discriminatory beliefs and behaviors, even attributing these beliefs and behaviors to other causes, for instance, dislike of this woman's pushiness, it has in recent years been confirmed by data culled from implicit association tests. A whole cottage industry has emerged around assessing and evaluating implicit bias data for new insights with regard to how we make associations that show bias along the lines of race, gender, age, disability status, nationality. Implicit bias is often measured through a series of implicit associations tests housed by Harvard University's Project Implicit. Those of you who are interested, they're actually really cool kind of tests to take. So if you just Google Project Implicit, you can log in and sign up and take some of these tests for yourself. For example, in the race implicit association test, test takers are encouraged to match positive or negative attributes with photographs of faces of different races. So you see in the, right there's face, and you're given a time test, essentially, time task to match these attributes, the category and the attribute, right, with the face. So depending on the test taker's responses are timed in order to gauge how strongly the associations are held. The thought is that the stronger associations will elicit faster responses. All right, so here's another one where you're giving categories, attributes, faces. So the idea is that the stronger your association is with, for instance, blackness and goodness, the faster you'll categorize things correctly. The data suggests that even those who explicitly profess egalitarian views show statistically significant stereotype consistent bias. Additional data shows that the extent to which one holds stereotype consistent beliefs also impacts one's views on public policy. For example, to the degree that one even implicitly believes that blacks are violent or prone to commit crime aligns with the degree to which one believes that public policy should favor tough on crime measures, such as mandatory minimums and zero tolerance policies. These beliefs would not be inconsistent with beliefs about how citizens should interact with the police and how the police should interact with us. The link between the view that blacks are inherently criminal and zero tolerance public policy could also lend support for, or at least apology or excuse for, racial profiling. So here we have an image of Eric Garner, and I imagine that some of you may have heard of him and what happened with his interaction with the police. There's actually a videotape. So Eric Garner was illegally selling cigarettes. I believe he was selling loosies, that's what they call them, right? So single cigarettes that are tagged. So this idea of zero tolerance policing, right, requires police to confront Garner for breaking the law. I mean, he is breaking the law, right? He's selling tagged cigarettes. What happened after that involved Mr. Garner being put in a chokehold, which is actually an illegal hold according to the NYPD, but right, and so he's taken to the ground and he suffocates and he died. And well, we'll just leave it at that. But to the idea that you think, well, black people are just inherently committing crime, the data seems to suggest that people are willing to support zero tolerance policing, or more inclined to support zero tolerance policing. Now, I'm not saying that people are inclined to support people dying over selling untaxed cigarettes, but, okay, I'm not saying it, but I'm saying that zero tolerance policing may create a climate where responding to police with anything less than unquestioning obedience may escalate situations. Okay. Did I say that nicely? I was trying to hard. So viewing racial profiling as at least sometimes legitimate would also color perceived appropriate responses to this practice, right? So to the extent that you think, yeah, it's legitimate for the police to engage in this kind of practice, then one might be more inclined to say, well, oops, sometimes bad things happen. But it doesn't mean that anything's wrong with the practice, it just means sometimes bad things happen. What am I going to say? What more am I going to say about this? So there's actually a videotape of this, right? A bystander caught this on his cell phone. I have not seen the videotape. I refuse to watch it. And in fact, even this image was a little upsetting for me. I decided to use it anyway. There's something kind of pure to me about these images of watching. And given that there very few indictments have come down as a result of wondering. That's something we can talk about. Let's talk about that. Let me get focused. Okay. So another example. If one believes that black people are violent by nature, then one can more easily, just right, we're talking about implicit bias again, right? So implicit bias, again, or the implicit associations tests are attempts to measure the biases that we have that we may not even be conscious of. So even though we might explicitly think that we're supposed to be egalitarian, the extent to which we hold a bias that, for example, black people are violent by nature, then one can more easily justify a police practice of approaching black people with guns blazing, regardless of the reason for the initial approach. So here we have Tamir Rice. Some of you may be familiar with this story, 12-year-old boy who was playing at the park with a toy gun, and someone called him, I don't know why anyone even bothered to call 911 about this, but someone did, and said, it's probably a toy, but as the police approached, they got out and immediately began firing. So, by the police's own admission, right, this isn't me making stuff up, they started firing in a matter of 1.2 seconds. So not even enough time to say, you know, put that down, who are you, what are you doing, right, they jump out of the car and immediately start firing. But to the extent that you think black people are violent and dangerous and God knows what they might be up to, it's not a far leap to think, okay, well, maybe I do need to, you know, go for my gun a little bit more quickly, I'm thinking. So furthermore, if one thinks that such a police practice is justifiable, then one might also think that black people have little cause for complaint when on the receiving end of this treatment, or that any such complaint should be tempered by understanding. After all, such practices aren't racist. They're just rational. And blacks should understand that no system is perfect and that mistakes will sometimes happen. We see this attitude in police departments and individual officers and in the public perception of police behavior. So now we see some response to Eric Garner's death. So apparently the last words, or among the last words that Eric Garner uttered were, "I can't breathe." And so we saw people taping their mouths. We saw lots of athletes. For some reason, this is a very exciting moment for me to see athletes really being explicitly political. I mean, we haven't really seen this since, I'm telling my age now, it's okay. We haven't really seen this since before Michael Jordan became famous, right? Michael Jordan kind of killed political activism in athletes because he was trying to sell sneakers, and he was real clear about that. He's like, hey, white people buy sneakers too. I don't want to do anything or say anything that's going to offend them. And a lot of athletes kind of took that attitude, that position of, you know, not being politically involved. So this is important, right? Political cartoons being involved also. But then you also have, right, police officer responding. Look, if you black people weren't running around committing crimes, then you wouldn't be put in accidental chokeholds. Right? Y'all don't buy it. Right. Breathe easy, don't break the law, right? It's that simple. The only reason Eric Garner ended up in a chokehold was because he was breaking the law. So FBI Director James Comey, and I'm not sure I'm saying his name correctly, but we'll go with that, speaking specifically about police practices, acknowledges that bias influences who the police even approach on some suspicion of commission of crime. So he says, likewise, police officers on patrol in our nation's cities often work in environments where a hugely disproportionate percentage of street crime is committed by young men of color. Well, a lot of times cities are disproportionately populated by people of color. Okay, we'll just do that. We'll just ignore that. So statistically, it makes sense that if your city is majority people. Something happens to people of goodwill working in that environment. After years of police work, officers often can't help but be influenced by the cynicism they a mental shortcut becomes almost irresistible and maybe even rational by some lights. The two young black men on one side of the street look like so many others the officer has locked up. Two white men on the other side of the street, even in the same clothes, do not. The officer does not make the same association about the two white guys, whether that officer is white or black. And that drives different behavior. The officer turns to one side of the street and not the other. We need to come to grips with the fact that this behavior complicates the relationship between the police and the communities they serve. So that's him speaking to Georgetown for I want to highlight the director's assertion that even in the same clothes, white men do not arouse the same kind of suspicion that black men arouse in the minds of police officers. And that's the case regardless of the color of the officer, right? He says that very explicitly. So I don't know, when Trayvon Martin, I don't know if any of you heard of Trayvon Martin, was murdered by George Zimmerman, some, including Geraldo Rivera, which, I don't know, most of you in this room were not alive when he had that show, but it's hard for me to take anything this man says seriously, given he had a kind of Jerry Springer-like talk show back in the 80s, and so it's just so weird to see him taken seriously as any sort of political commentator. But anyway, one of the things he said was, black people should just stop wearing hoodies. Like, if black people would stop wearing hoodies, then it wouldn't scare white people, and then maybe y'all would just find yourselves getting shot. It all boils down to stop getting yourself shot and choked and murdered in the streets. This should not be a shocking revelation. Police are people existing in society, right? I mean, they're not above society. They live in society too. And it stands to reason they would be subject to the same biases as everybody else. Additionally, the fact that the police are the ones who make arrests seems to make these mental shortcuts, of which the director speaks, irresistible. The fact that police are vested with the authority of the state makes these mental shortcuts all the more frightening for some, but a source of relief for others. Ta-Nehisi Coates of The Atlantic, also another Howard, writes, racism is not merely a simplistic hatred. It is more often a broad sympathy towards some and a broader skepticism towards others. This idea goes to the heart of many who would protest discriminatory treatment at the hands of police. It is not a hatred for the police or a recognition that innocent mistakes sometimes happen. Rather, it is seeing this sympathy towards some and skepticism toward others at play day after day, which prompts the assertion that Black Lives Matter. So those of you who are on Twitter, even if you're not on Twitter, that movement transcends Twitter. Or the shared pain of Alive While Black, which also is another hashtag trending on Twitter. Or Hands Up, Don't Shoot. Right? You see people everywhere taking these photographs, all last semester in the fall. Meanwhile, acknowledgement of this broad sympathy experienced by some has driven Criming Wild White. I don't know if is anybody familiar with Criming Wild White? So is this hashtag that also kind of made the rounds on Twitter of white people talking about all the crimes they've committed, and sometimes they've been caught and they've had these interactions with the police that just kind of ended in, okay, well just go home and don't get in any more trouble. I mean, that's literally what all of these stories ended. Yeah, I had a DUI and I ran into 3 parked cars. When the police saw me, they just said, go home, don't get in any more trouble. Yeah, I, stole $800 worth of stuff out of Bloomingdale's because I knew they were watching a black person and not me. And at the end of the day, they just told me to give it back and go home, don't get in any more trouble. Right? I mean, so if you look at, those of you who are on Twitter, if you just find the hashtag Criming Wild White, it's fascinating and instructive. Right. Didn't want to put that. All right. Resume bias. So I want to shift focus for a few minutes from the practice of evaluating potential criminals to the practice of evaluating potential employees. One manifestation of sympathy versus skepticism comes in the form of resume bias. DeVito and Gartner have been doing work on aversive racism since the 1970s. Aversive racism is an attempt to characterize the racial attitudes of many whites who endorse egalitarian views, who regard themselves as non-prejudiced, but who discriminate in subtle, rationalizable ways. Their earliest work addressed how helping tendencies varied across race. Their findings were that whites were less likely to give even low-cost help to blacks who asked for it. So their famous example, and this is really gonna tell somebody's age probably, right, is what they call the PFunk Experiments. So did y'all be doing a payphone? Have y'all seen a payphone? Right, so someone would call a random number from the payphone and say something like, my car broke down, right? They're thinking they're calling a mechanic, but they're actually calling someone's house, and they say something like, my car broke down, and this is my last quarter. You know, would you mind calling a mechanic? I'm at such and such a street and sending them my way. And what they found was that to the extent that one imagines he or she can tell whether the voice they're hearing belongs to someone black or someone white, that white people hung up on black folks much more quickly than they hung up on white folks. Right, so there were categories of response, right? So one could be that you just hang up on a person regardless. And another could be you go, oh yeah, sure, okay, I'll make that call and I'll send a mechanic their way. And it turned out that black people got hung up on more quickly, right? Very few even got to the, would you call the mechanic stage of the conversation. But of the ones who did, fewer white receivers of those calls were willing to make the call. Does that make sense? I feel like I explained that in a really convoluted way. But okay, so that's kind of their claim to fame from the 70s through the early 2000s. Okay. In more recent findings, it has been revealed that hypothetical black candidates for jobs, school admissions, campus positions tend to be rated lower than their white counterparts with similar qualifications when the candidates are not clearly exceptional or clearly bad, which frankly is most candidates, right? I mean, most people fall somewhere in the middle. As much as we like to think we're a nation full of people who are above average, we know that mathematically that's not possible, right? For everybody to be above average. Most of us are average. Okay, in other words, candidates who are off the charts good or off the charts bad tend to be rated relatively similarly, regardless of their race. However, those who fall in the middle, which again is most of us, tend to be penalized about 20% for being black, right? So just the mere fact of being black is worth like a 20% cut right off the top. So furthermore, in resume bias studies conducted by Burrstone and colleagues, the same resumes were regarded differently when headed by the name Greg versus the name Jamal, or the name Lakeisha versus the name Emily. So to the extent that people think that one's name can give you a clue about racial identity or gender identity or national origin, those resumes just right off the top get marked down. Just looking at the name, not even looking at the content, right? Not even looking at the content. So if this data is correct, it seems to give credence to the old adage among African Americans that one has to be twice as good to get half as much. I don't know if black people are still telling their children that, but I may be among the last. I don't know if I'm among the last generation. But that was very commonly heard in this corner. You have to be twice as good to get half as much. Mediocrity can land you in the White House. Okay, so while different from second-order discrimination, implicit bias seems to rely on similar psychological processes. So, in both the case of second-order discriminator and the implicitly biased, the discriminating or biased behavior is not justified or justifiable on the grounds of overt hostility. Rather, the second-order discriminator and the implicitly biased appeal to non-racial features in order to justify their behavior. These practices, when coupled with fuzzy but seemingly non-racial justifications like fit or standard, some of you may not have heard this language yet, but there's often conversation around admitting students to undergraduate school and graduate programs and admitting candidates to certain jobs. People sit around the table and go, I wonder if this person will fit in with the culture of our school, our institution, our workplace, right? Or does this person meet our standards? And often those words are kind of fuzzy, right? non-racial language can leave actors feeling comfortable in their biased or discriminatory decisions, while leaving those who have been on the receiving end of these practices little recourse to complain without seeming like whiners or like people in search of a handout, right? You just want a handout, right? You just want to write for it. Meanwhile, the status quo goes unchallenged and is continually reinforced. I deliberately took this detour into resume bias for a few reasons. First, I wanted to emphasize how bias and discrimination exist throughout society and don't simply exist in the realm of policing. Second, many will have little or no interaction with police officers, no direct interaction. And for some in the room, these interactions will always be friendly and respectful. So it may be hard to imagine what it feels like to inspire the suspicion of those who are supposed to protect and serve. Yet many of us will be in a position as job candidates and perhaps even as evaluators of job candidates or admissions candidates, right? Most of us will apply to something at some point. Being able to see oneself in that position may inspire an understanding of bias and discrimination that police-led racial bias and discrimination may not. Third, because the stakes are different with job seekers versus police interaction, it may be more difficult for some to appeal to second-order justifications for discriminatory behavior on the part of police officers. Yet, it is precisely because the stakes are so high, actually life and death, that those who protest this injustice have little patience or apologists for unchecked discriminatory, biased police behavior. So what's the upshot? I wish I could tie all of this neatly with a bow. Unfortunately, I cannot. I've offered some preliminary insights, and what I hope I've shown is that the story is much more complicated than the police are just racist, or the protesters are just whining and looking to excuse lawlessness. No one of serious thinking and good faith would deny that police officers sometimes find themselves in dangerous circumstances. Yet acknowledging this is not the same as offering carte blanche to the police, nor should it automatically absolve the police when they make mistakes. Undertaking this particular project requires me to juggle many, sometimes competing ideas. I began with the general ideas of political authority, justification, and obligation. These questions have loomed large in political philosophy for millennia, taking special shape at the beginning of the modern period. The very question of what is legitimate for police to do as agents of the state and how citizens may legitimately respond is filtered through the lens of how one imagines the role of the state. If one believes that the state can demand unquestioning obedience, then one will imagine that the police have broad license to enforce the laws they see fit. Citizen response to that should be one of understanding, not protest, and certainly not rowdy, disruptive protest. But if one thinks that the state should exist in service of its citizens, then one may think that the police should have more constraints on their behavior as they interact as agents of the state with the citizenry. And if these constraints are violated, the citizens have recourse that may include disruptive protest. So you're familiar with the die-ins? So in response to many of these killings, people all over the country, all over the world even, right? If you just do a Google image search on die-in, you'll see these people who are, drawing chalk outlines in protest and sometimes blocking traffic, right? They'll just go on the George Washington Bridge or something, 200 strong, and just lie in the street for 5 minutes or 4 minutes. Here's one. I want to say this med school, so med student station time. So if the constraints are violated, then the citizens have recourse that may include disruptive protest or even revolutionary overthrow of the state. Both of these ideas fall on a continuum that forms the basis of political theory in the West. Additionally, these ideas have not existed in a vacuum. Far from solely existing in the realm of ideas, the state and how we think about the state operates in the actual world. In the actual world, both first and second order discrimination exist. Implicit bias exists. I choose to focus on second order discrimination and implicit bias because they have explanatory power. They help us understand how bias and discrimination exist in society that has, according to some accounts, overcome racism. We heard this a lot when Barack Obama got elected in 2008, right? Now we don't think about race, we're all post-racial, and we can all go hold hands and sing, and it's fine. There was an old Coke commercial that used to come on in the 70s, I'm sure you can find this on YouTube, where, Coca-Cola self-conscious, I'm really dating myself for this one, right? Where Coca-Cola self-consciously, picks all these multiracial people to stand on a hill holding hands and singing about how they'd like to teach the world to sing. I'd like to teach the world to sing perfect harmony. I'd like to buy the world a Coke. Keep it company. Right, all these people are singing and all that. It's very beautiful, like that. Right? And of course, they're all singing about Coca-Cola. Eduardo Bonilla Silva explores this idea in his cleverly titled book, Racism Without Racists. Second-order discrimination and implicit bias also offer a glimpse into the inner workings of bias and discrimination that shows how some may experience bias and discrimination even in the absence of overt hostility and violence, and how bias and discrimination can quickly escalate into violence. I also hope that I provided a preliminary explanation of how or why some responses to state violence are deemed appropriate or not. So thank you.
I'll try and moderate on your behalf, so you don't have to do that. But all of them, Laura, thank you very much for being an attentive audience. If you have any questions, please.
I had a question about the study of the phone calls. Was it just phone calls to white people, or was it a diverse group of participants?
So, what the video was interested in was white responses. I think there were white and black people who were called to the extent that that was controlled for. But yeah, there was curiosity about how they would respond, and so the people called were actually Confederates of the country. But it's an old study, so I mean, similar studies have been replicated. Like that particular study that I referred has been replicated, but that was one of the early ones. So that's why I wanted to refer to it.
Also, I had a follow-up question. Were they asked, the people who were making phone calls to the phone booth or whatever the case may be, were they asked to speak the same way or speak in a different tone, so to speak, or
Yes.
say different words?
Yes, so they were given a script. They weren't reading the script. But of course, they practiced. And there was an attempt to try to control for things like regionalism, manner of speech, pace of speech. So it wasn't, right, in an attempt to not confound the data. So there was an attempt to, I don't want to say control for educational background, but certainly to control for speech pattern. Right, but it's still kind of fascinating that, right, I mean, this is getting beyond your question. But I find it fascinating that sometimes when people say, this person sounds white or sounds black or sounds whatever, there's an assumption that you're talking about diction and grammar. That sounding black is synonymous with speaking broken English. And I don't think that's the case. I mean, the data was significant enough that even when controlling for those things, there was still a way that the recipients of the phone call was able to perceive racialized difference over the phone. I mean, some of us try to pretend that doesn't exist, but maybe it does. I don't think, I mean, it's possible that I have an inflated sense of my own self and how I sound, but I think I have a pretty firm grasp of the English language. Yet I think if I called someone who didn't know me, even without knowing my name, I think that it wouldn't be a stretch to mark me black. And depending on how good that person is with language, to even mark me as Southern. The Southern thing tends to come out more when I'm angry or excited. But I'm very Georgia. Very Georgia.
I was wondering what you thought you think we as a society can do to try to address implicit bias, and specifically what your reaction is to the work of people like Nicholas Kristof and his columns trying to draw awareness to I think some of the things that you might be interested in.
Yeah, I knew somebody was going to ask me that question. What do we do? Can I talk about the problem? What do we do? So there are some, right, here's a kind of interesting. At least the implicit bias data isn't consistent on how that works. So there's some studies that seem to suggest that, for instance, if one takes, there's some studies that suggest that responses to the implicit association test can be primed or manipulated. So for instance, if you show a test taker a picture of a favored, I'll just use black and white just to keep it simple, right? A favored black person, right? Somebody black that people think well of, like Martin Luther King, right? Everybody knows Martin Luther King. And a picture of someone white who is disvalued, like Hitler or Marilyn Manson. Although there's some people who really admire Hitler, but in general, at least in polite, right? That if you show them that right before they take the IAT, that you can actually prime them to be less discriminatory. However, there's some data that, and that the effect will last, right? You can bring them back into the lab a week later and, there's still these effects that seem to exist. However, there's some people who think that talking about race makes us even more racist, right? It makes us dig into our racism. The IAT data is, right, so it's a mixed bag, and some of that is going to be the study design, sample size, and all of those kinds of things that impact any study. Nicholas Kristof, he's an interesting guy. I was happy to see he's done a lot with thinking about sex trafficking with young girls, and he was even writing a few columns on ways that I thought were interesting and somewhat insightful in particularly challenging white people to think about race, right? He's a columnist for the New York Times, for those who don't know, he's a white columnist for the New York Times. However, Kristof took a left a few weeks ago on Twitter, where he suggested very strongly that rather than protesting murders of, say, Mike Brown, for example, that Black Lives Matter activists and those who would be inclined to support the endeavor would do better to care about Tamir Rice. So he's committing, right, a few problems. There are a few problems with this tweet. One, people did care about Tamir Rice. Two, Tamir Rice was killed several months later after Michael Brown. Three, there's a kind of launch into what makes a worthwhile victim, as opposed to kind of thinking about the behavior and the practice of the actor. We see that kind of conversation in rape discourse too, right? Well, if that woman wasn't so slutty, then maybe she would have been so big. Black people would just stop running around committing crimes. We wouldn't be so choked. It's kind of subtext of Kristof. And he got dragged over Twitter, and justifiably so for that. But, he made a misstep, and a lot of us make missteps. And he was called out for it, and we all should be. So yeah, I think he's had some interesting things to say.
And I don't know how well this is formulated, so maybe it's just an opportunity for you to speak more.
It's a pontificate.
But I love the use of the phrase mental shortcuts, which is almost like so sickeningly sweet to describe what happens. what's crazy is I started thinking about this, and I started thinking, well, how do people justify this, right? They say, well, the police have to employ mental shortcuts because there's a tremendous amount at stake. And this is how they justify it. And because we tend to think, well, maybe it's okay for the police to do this stuff, but it's not okay to do this in resume evaluation. Because there's more at stake. Well, you know where there's also more at stake? There's more at stake for the citizen.
Yeah, there's more safe when you're on the other side of the gun.
Precisely, right? So shouldn't people be less inclined to use mental shortcuts when there's more at stake on behalf of other people? So I guess just you drew connections between those two. Can you draw some more connections on the basis of the use of mental shortcuts between resident evaluation and police body?
Yeah, I mean, I'm with you. I think when there's more at stake, right? I mean, I think that gives you more reason to be careful, and not just that there's more at stake, but also that police are vested with this authority, right? I can't run around shooting people just because I feel in danger. I mean, I have to be able to say more about it than, oh, I felt in danger. But it seems like some of the police are able to just say, I mean, we give them authority to carry guns roaming around. New York seems to be a state that has stricter gun laws, right? In Georgia, people do carry guns roaming around. You know, in Georgia, you can carry a gun in a bar now, or a church, or a daycare. It's very odd. So maybe Georgia isn't the best example. But in a lot of parts of the country, and certainly in a lot of parts of the world, the average citizen can't just roam around with a gun, even though for whatever reason we think that the police should be able to, right? Because they're performing a different kind of duty. They're providing a service to protect all of us. So yeah, I mean, I do think, presumably they're trained. The guy who shot Tamir Rice, he was like a reject from a couple of different people. You know, he got hired to do anything. We would have hired him to be a mall cop. Whatever they let him have. Right, but so yeah, I think that there should be even more careful training and thinking, and that since the stakes are higher, they should be held to account. I mean, what does it say when you can kill people who are unarmed and not even be indicted for it when you're using an illegal chokehold? What does that say to the citizens? How does that make any of us feel safe and secure? And what does that say when police, in response to this lack of indictment, run around printing up t-shirts that say breathe easy, don't commit crime, or obey the law, breathe easy? Like, what, really? Right, when the police themselves aren't willing to take a stand and say, you know what, Officer Smith was out of line, and that is unacceptable. He does not represent what we stand for. What does that mean when police officers in Ferguson take over their name tags so that protesters can't identify them? Do a Google image search. See, I mean, they're clear about it, right? They were on camera taking over their name, right? But I had my students do a project, so there's this test online, it might be interesting if you take it, formulated by Joshua, I want to say his name is Correll, C-O-R-R-E-L-L, at the University of Colorado, the shooter bias test. I don't know if any of you have taken it, it's a video game, actually. And you have to make split-second decisions whether to shoot, an unarmed target versus an armed target. And the data that comes out of that shows that unarmed black men are shot more quickly, not just by white test takers, but also by black test takers. And that armed black men are shot more quickly than armed white men. So, you know, there might be some bias stuff happening there, but that might be worth looking at for those of you who are interested and want to test yourself.
I guess this is in relation to Professor Perry's question. Maybe I'm perceiving what you're saying in the wrong way, but it sounds like you're saying that when cops, it's a personal choice when a cop pulls out his gun to shoot anyone coming at them. Don't you think it's a systemic change or a fundamental change within training of police officers to why they have to draw their gun and shoot it, or why there's no excuse for the child? I forgot his name. Samir. There's no excuse for that for Eric Gardner. But if someone's coming at you and you're trained to defend yourself and drawing your weapon is a part of that, don't you you think it's systemic and not personal at that point?
Yeah. But I mean, there's nothing inconsistent about the idea that something can be systemic and also reflect an individual choice. But yeah, absolutely. I mean, the fact that there's what you call a ambulant, right? I mean, people talk about the blue wall and moral silence or right? I mean, you also see it because you see it as systemic in that black officers are doing this too. And again, remember that one of the very first things I said was that the popular media portrayal is this racist white cop who's just gone rogue and runs around shooting people and is incompetent or whatever. But we see black people stopping and harassing and shooting black citizens too at disproportionate rates. In other words, even in a perfect society, you might expect that there will be some rates of unarmed people being injured or shot. It's just how things happen. But you see these disproportionate numbers of this happening to black people, regardless of the race of the officer. I mean, the FBI director himself admits this, regardless of the race of the officer. Who police officers think is committing crime, how they approach those people. It's certainly not just a result of, oh, this person made a bad choice, right? Of a bunch of individuals making bad choices. Yeah, that's not the whole story.
With the implicit association test and project implicit, I'm curious if once someone is aware of the bias that they have, if that changes at all. So if they find out they have a bias and then a week later they take the same or similar test again, do the results change at all?
Well, in some of the priming cases, it can be regulated, it changes. I'm sure there's data about that. I would have to refresh.
Does project implicit have a mission or anything? Like get rid of the implicit bias?
You know, it's fascinating.
Just researching it.
Yeah, more research. But they have all of these tests, right? You can take them along gender, you can take them along disability, nationality, ethnicity. They're so fascinating. To show where our, right, I mean, I should just offer a caveat around these implicit association tests, right? One criticism is that on some level, they might not be measuring bias as much as just kind of cognitive associations. So to the extent that the stereotype exists in the world, associating, for example, black people in criminality, if you throw that up on the screen, throw something up on the screen that looks like that, it might be more activating a kind of cultural association rather than kind of deep feelings. That's one critique. I don't know how good a critique that is, but it's a kind of standard criticism of these kinds of tests. So what the implicit association test would have to show is that it's not just measuring the cognitive associations based on images or attitudes that are just in the world, but it really is showing something that's inherent in us. And I think that part of what they do is kind of switch photographs and attributes and characteristics in an attempt to try to get at that. And also appealing to characteristics and attributes that aren't readily stereotype consistent, right?
Do you think that because black people know that there's this bias, that the police have against them, or that, I guess I know how to say that, they act differently, and that we're treated differently, like in a cycle?
But, so, I'm sorry, say.
Like, they know that they have the bias against them, so that they would like act differently than, say, a white person, like, if they know that there's no bias.
Oh, okay. So, there have been a lot of, in media, certainly in the black press, there have been a lot of articles recently. I mean, there's kind of a long tradition of these kinds of articles guiding black behavior, specifically with regards to this. So, and some of us in this room may have had these conversations with our parents. If you get pulled over by the police, make sure you keep your hands on the steering wheel. Make sure you do everything, make sure you say yes, ma'am, make sure you say no. Right, there's a way that, Black parents are more likely to raise their children with these kinds of conversations. And one of the ways that bias works, that discrimination works, is the fact that Black parents feel like they have to have these conversations as part of preparing their children to move into the world. But also the idea that you can't just have an off day. Right? There's a fundamental denial of humanity in stressing that folks interact a certain way. Right? I'm not saying that we shouldn't be respectful to police or to anyone that we interact with, but there's just kind of a weird, there's a way that I can't just say, why are you stopping me? I haven't done anything wrong. And that gets interpreted as not just disobedient, not just this person might be a jerk, but it's potentially threatening, or as a kind of opening salvo to further threatening behavior. And that in response to that, the interaction may escalate. So do people behave any differently? Probably. I mean, many of us have certainly talked to behave differently. I'm curious, how many, should I do this? How many of you were raised having been taught either directly by your parents or other people in your community or through the kind of media that you regularly consume, how to interact with the police? How many of you never had that kind of conversation? How many, so one thing that my mother taught, I don't know why she was saying this, such a weird thing that I listened to. Sometimes you run into a convenience store, maybe you get a Snickers bar or something. My mother's thing with me was always to get a bag, right? Even if it was just one thing. I always make sure you have a bag and a receipt, because you don't want to be accused of stealing. You don't want it to turn into a thing. So you want to be able to make sure that you are completely in the right. And I don't know if white parents told their children the same thing. And I'm not saying that they didn't, but there's just kind of a way of thinking about behavior, constraining behavior, and thinking about respectability that becomes a little cumbersome, right? Why can't I just give them a damn Snicker bar and eat it right there? I don't know if that answers your question. It's kind of meandered along.
You talked a lot about the issues in our nation. I was wondering how the issues and stereotypical issues differ from our nation and other nations.
Okay, so my work primarily is around U.S. context. However, so a lot of that is just going to look different, right? Even what stereotypes dominate a culture, right? Dominate a society are going to be culturally different. Are there stereotypes in other countries? Yeah, about their minority population. Yeah, I would say yeah, but I can't really give a strong answer about how this looks in Zimbabwe or how this looks in. I don't know. It might look sort of similarly in Canada, sort of. To the extent, no, Canada's a much,
I don't know if they told you that.
Yeah.
That's right.
But yeah, the police are just different. I mean, so the U.S., one thing about the U.S. and our police is, right, we have a huge police force. And our police are armed to the teeth in ways that they just aren't in other places. You know, maybe places that have like these military coups or kind of crazy armies are running around, but it's just as a regular run-of-the-mill police force. I don't think you're gonna find many places in Canada where the police have armored tanks.
No, I mean, there's
And-
also, Canadian citizens have less guns.
Yeah.
So there's more guns in the US, but there's certainly, I mean, a Canadian cop can just as easily not have a gun as have, if you see one.
You know what I'm saying?
Says something. Plenty, no, sorry.
Our police forces have tanks now. Some of them do not. We get military surplus of all kinds of crazy weapons. All kinds of Humvees, bulletproof. Why do we need all this? Write tickets for jaywalking. I mean, because some of these forces that have these things are really small municipalities. And yet they feel like they need that.
I think that the thing is that I don't think any of our police forces have gotten as heavily armed as because of the 9/11. Our police forces are going to be our armed forces when we get, invaded by other countries, because our armies and our navies cannot get to us quick enough as a society. But our police force is going to be pretty much our savior. That's why they're so heavily armed.
But our police forces are not trained as military personnel, they're trained as police officers.
Most of them are though.
Well, some
They
of
go
them may
through
be
the SWAT and all
ex-military,
this.
yeah, but that's not the same thing as being currently in the military.
You'll see that they are, because we come from a small town and they are heavily, they go through the chemical warfare, they go through the SWAT training, and for a small community, and
It's a lot.
yeah, sometimes the streets are hard. It's a war zone. No matter what type, how big the community or diversity,
We did see a lot of these after September 11th, right? I mean, you saw people with towns of 300 people. The terrorists are gonna get us next. Who's gonna get you? Because you bring in the people. That's why, because no one was suspected. Right, so there's a kind of suspicion. Maybe it's just.
I mean, do you think our police should be armed with guns, or what do you think they should do in a situation where their lives are being threatened, whether the person is white or black, whether threatening them?
Oh, I absolutely think the police should have guns. Nothing I've said suggests that they shouldn't have guns. I never said they shouldn't have guns. What I said was, it concerns me that we allow the police to have running into circumstances with guns blazing, shoot first type of behavior that goes unchecked. That concerns me. It should concern all of us. The rise of no-knock warrants concerns me deeply. It should concern all of us. Not just because you think we need to protect the criminals, which, I think part of the mark of a civilized society is, how we treat everyone, even people who might think shouldn't have right. But also because mistakes get made. When you have a no-knock warrant, when you can just kick in a door without even knocking or identifying yourself, what happens when you're at the wrong house and you shoot someone's sleeping child? As happened in New York. Or what happens when you're at the wrong house and you pump a 92-year-old woman full of bullets? As happened in Georgia. Because the police came to her house with guns blazing and didn't identify themselves and didn't knock. And she thought someone was breaking in her house, so she shows up with her gun and they pumped her full of liquor. Which frankly, I'm not mad that even as a homeowner, right? I think even as homeowners, if you feel like you need to have a gun to defend your home, I think that should be legitimate. But I think it's very dangerous for homeowners to have guns and for police to not have to identify themselves before they come through your door. And I mean, that's just gonna end. There's no way that can end okay. There just isn't. And we see that it already has ended okay for some people. But yeah, absolutely. I think we should have guns.
Speaking as someone who comes from a culture where the police don't have guns, I think some exceptions to some of those comments. But I think one of the things that's interesting to talk about here is what's happening in something that an earlier speaker identified, which is the militarization of the police.
Yeah.
Because what we're looking at is a very corrosive and subtle thing, which actually happens through budgets. Excessive military equipment is geared donated to police forces.
Yeah, I just said, yeah.
And along with that excess military equipment comes military tactics, military attitudes, military ideals, military senses of purpose, and the idea of a community policing.
Yeah, that's not consistent with seeing yourself as a military person in an occupied space.
Right.
Yeah.
And that really is an incredible concern. It doesn't matter what race you are. I mean, as you say, the no warrant is just one possible, or one superficial thing about that. I mean, the whole attitude towards the very much, the very sort of deep division between the us and them, between the us as the military police and them as the criminals, whoever the criminals might be, really erodes the possibility of anything like cooperative policing, anything like community policing. And it really doesn't matter who's on the receiving end of that, what color they are.
Yeah, I think that should be deeply concerning for all of us.
So you said that when it comes to university admissions, that middle of the road black people get dropped like 20%. Like they're just seen as 20% less capable than their white counterparts. I saw a study online where researchers found out that people with perceived weird names are considered less. They think it's some sort of evolutionary thing. Do you know if they factored that in with those? Like with the 20% loss, and determine what was just because people thought their names were weird versus their race?
So I'm not gonna yeah, so sometimes even what we think of as weirdness tracks race. Can. I said sometimes, not always. Sometimes weirdness can be synonymous with foreignness. Weirdness. Sometimes, you have, right, so there are different kinds of weird names, right? Sometimes there are weird names like, who's that actress? I think Gwyneth Paltrow named her kid Apple or something absurd like that, right? Even I'm making a judgment about her, right? Naming your child Apple is absurd. I'm just gonna go on record and admit to that. So that's one kind of weirdness, right? There's another kind of weirdness that tracks real or imagined foreignness. Sometimes immigrant names have that feature. Right? What is this? I can't say this. And sometimes there's a weirdness that tracks a kind of prejudice against certain forms of creativity. Like, and it goes hand in hand with the kind of attitude that certain people are just ignorant or uneducated or just too stupid to give their children real names. Like the kind of old joke that was going around on the internet many, many years ago around a young woman whose name is, what is it, L-A, and then hyphen A, and it's like, how do you pronounce it? LaDasha, because the dash isn't silent, right? I mean, there's a kind of racist trope, right? These dumbass black people can't give their children real names and certainly can't spell them. Right, so I've seen the weirdness studies, but I'd also be interested in them kind of drilling down what weirdness means. Because I think that weirdness, the role that weirdness plays can shift depending on the nature of the weirdness. Does that make sense? If it's the kind of weirdness and this is just unique, right? They have to be parents who name their kids apple and rainbow. That might look different than the kind of weirdness that feels like these dumbass people just can't name their kids.
In continuing to consider the impact that names have on resume evaluation, would the advent and the rise of popularity of platforms like LinkedIn, for example, where the resume is accompanied by a headshot or a photo, what are your thoughts on how the headshot might exacerbate bias or prejudicial attitudes?
Yeah, I don't know. I think that can cut both ways. Yeah. The headshot thing is kind of interesting, right? Because sometimes people can look at the headshot to kind of rule you out. And sometimes people get real glammed up in these headshots too, right? Making me unapproachable. Right? So sometimes people can use their headshots and companies can use their headshots or use headshots of others in order to make positive judgments. Right? The name thing is kind of interesting. You know, so you see people sometimes self-consciously using initials instead of names to kind of mask gender or race in an attempt to do that. But yeah, now that you can just Google everybody, I don't know if that's a, you know, I don't know if that works. Maybe it'll get your foot in the door before they leave.
Well, in terms of names and like job opportunities, like being a Lakeisha or Jamal could pose a disadvantage, but could it also pose a fake advantage? And I say fake advantage like for a company to advertise diversity and hire a black person just so they can add it to a roster, would that be racism as well?
So this is interesting, right? So first, I think there's a myth that people just get hired to show up and be black. I mean, you know, we need, well, this don't exist in any kind of official way. We just don't. I mean, read the Bakke case from 1976, BAKA, where the Supreme Court talks about how these follows. But answer your question, not to get in that. Yeah, I mean, I think that happens, right? Oh, we need, and I had a white girlfriend as a child named Serena. And there's a way that, you know, seeing her name, I think people assume that she was black. And we're always surprised when this, you know, blonde white girl showed up. So yeah, I think that people do manipulate names for good or for bad, or make judgments about names for good or for bad. And sometimes they're surprised by that. Surprised by what they do.
So like, I'm not sure if this is like legal or if you could do this, but couldn't you kind of like, I don't know, maybe make a law that like, for people, the process of getting, like sending your resume, and whoever looks at it, they don't see the name, they don't, I'm not sure actually how it really works with that. I'm not sure some people do that, like they just get rid of everything and then like, they check it through, then the guy or whatever, they can pass it off to the next person, and they actually look at it and start, isn't that what people do?
Yeah, so there is a way to look at resumes blind. Yeah, and that
Shouldn't that
actually
be
is.
like the way?
Shouldn't that just be the standard?
Yeah, seems to make sense.
It seems to make sense.
And the number, one.
Yeah. Sometimes you can, sometimes that works. Sometimes I think people make judgments or assumptions based on other information on the resume. For example, people might assume even without a name that a women's studies major is a woman. It's not the case that all women's studies majors are women, but many of them are greater than 50%. or whether they're trying to offer grounds to either support or discriminate against someone. But yeah, even blind resume review isn't perfect, but I think it is a good first step. Yeah.
Do you believe that our police force would be better off unarmed?
Well, I'm a Southern girl, so I'm not really sure that I'm better off now. I don't, right, I'm not advocating disarming the police. So no, I mean, that was kind of a quick response, but I don't think we should do like they do in the UK and just not arm our police. Is it possible? I mean, yeah, I mean, it's certain. I'm not against the idea of arming police. I'm just not. I am against the idea of arming police without being very clear about training, without being very clear about circumstances under which weapons are to be discharged, and without also making available non-lethal means of subduing citizens if one feels that that is that one can avail oneself of non-lethal means. And I'm opposed to a kind of unquestioning, or not unquestioning, a kind of presumption that the police are in the right when they use their weapons. And right now, I think there is that presumption that, oh, this officer felt in danger. So we're just gonna go with that until we can prove otherwise. I think that the officer should have to show that this was the only option. And certainly in a case like with Tamir Rice, where a weapon is fired 1.2 seconds after you arrive on the scene, I don't think any officer can, in good faith, make that kind of claim. I just don't see it. But yeah, I think you should have to defend your use of lethal force, even if no one dies. Just the mere fact that you pulled a gun on somebody, you need to be able to explain that and defend that choice. And I don't think it's bad to say that you should have to defend your choice for pulling a gun on somebody, because if you're really in the right, well, what's the big deal?
I'm curious what you think on regard to like protest issues and things like that. I know, like on Twitter and other things, you know, I personally am very invested in this, but I also understand that I don't necessarily have that stigma. I mean, I didn't grow up with the same fears. I wear a hoodie and I don't think anything of it. So I noticed lately on Twitter that, and other various social media things, that a lot of black people are saying that white people are coming in and trying to take this over and make it like part of like our fight as well. And I was just wondering what you think about that.
I think that, first of all, I think that all of us should be very concerned about how the police treat us. I don't see that as something that just black people should care about, or just Latinos should care about, even though we're the ones who just black and Latinos are disproportionately impacted by this. So no, I think it's very important that everyone sees that this is important. At the same time, I understand concern that when people try to work across race, sometimes, I don't know if I want to say old or traditional or conventional, racialized dynamics come into play. And I think it's important to be mindful of that and to think carefully about that. Right? I mean, we saw this even back in the 60s and the 50s during the Civil Rights Movement. This idea that what starts bringing national press to parts of the South? Well, when northern white kids who were coming down to help started getting beat up by police. And I think that we have to acknowledge that as part of the reality of the world in which we live. And so, you know, while I supported, for example, Crime and Wildlife, because I found it interesting and instructive, right, to see people people were copping to some stuff, like some felony level shit they were copping to, right? I mean, this is amazing. There was this criticism that, oh, now white people are making it about them. And I don't think that every instance of white people sharing their experiences is an attempt for them to make something about them. I mean, I think it's really important to say, to juxtapose that, right? Eric Garner gets choked to death for selling cigarettes. And yet you have people on Twitter admitting to DUIs and robbing and I mean, I think it's important to really shine a light on that. I was shocked. I mean, Dave Chappelle has this old bit, right, where he talks about doing things with his white friends. And I think he was somewhere in the city with one of his white friends, and they're lost, but they're also smoking weed, but they're trying to figure out where they're going. You know, Dave Chappelle wonders if, well, you know, part of the reason we might have been lost is because we were lost. Right? So one of his white friends approaches the officer and is like, you know, officer, I'm a little high, but I'm also lost. Can you tell us how to get to, right? And Dave Chappelle is like, what, are you crazy? You can't do that. But so there are these moments that I think we should be aware of. And part of, right, I mean, Dave Chappelle's doing it through humor, but he's also making biting social criticism here. How is it that someone white can just, that his white friend, not someone, right, that his white friend can feel so comfortable? Not just approaching the police high, but approaching the police high and copping to being high, and then asking for help in the same breath. And not thinking twice about it. I mean, part of why you might not think twice about it is he's actually high, but that he would do it.
I wonder to what extent you think gender is part of the consideration here. Society is predominantly female, the police force is predominantly male. All the tragic cases you mentioned involve males.
Ah, yes, yeah. This is an important piece of discussion, and I'm so glad that you mentioned this. Even, right, and I did this myself, right? The cases that I mentioned were all, well, one black boy and one black man. And I think that part of what gets lost in this conversation is this perception that the subtext of Black Lives Matter is somehow that black men's lives matter, or that black boys' lives matter, and that we leave out the role that gender plays in this picture. And how it might look different, but it's not any less important, and the same kind of social forces are at play. And not just with black women's lives, but there's a way that, right now, just in life and death scenarios. So there was a police officer in Oklahoma, Daniel Holzclaw, who explicitly targeted, I don't know, has anybody heard this story? Right, he's in Oklahoma, and he explicitly targeted, I want to say, black women and Latinas for rape. And he's a serial rapist running around as an officer of the police force. And he targeted them specifically because, right, so not just racialized reasons, but also gender reasons. And also reasons of social class, right? So these women were overwhelmingly poor and working class women, many of whom had prior convictions or at least negative interactions with the police. He targeted them for rape, and he was able to target them precisely because he was a police officer. So he's able to pull their jackets, run plates, figure out who's who and where they're going. But also because, given how our society is structured and given how many of us are programmed to think about rape and what the perfect rape victim looks like, he figured no one will believe these women if they go forward, if they come forward. And the truth is, most of those women didn't go forward. And he didn't just rape them as a one-off. He would repeatedly show up at their homes and threaten them with arrest. I can make this drug charge go away, right? Or find them with the drugs. I can make this charge go away if you give me a blowjob. Right? This level of insanity. How did he get caught? Because he has been caught. Hasn't gone to trial yet. But how did he get caught? Well, he got comfortable. And instead of doing his due diligence and, you know, only targeting women who had these police records. He happened to be in a neighborhood and targeted a middle-aged black woman. I think she was close to 60. She's in her 50s, 60s. Targeted this black woman who just happened to be driving through the neighborhood on her way to the suburbs where she lived, right? So she's not one of these poor working class women with police records, right? Pulled her over, sexually assaulted her, and what did she do? She went to her family and they all went straight to the police and said, look, this police officer pulled me over. Why was she able to report her assault? Well, her class status and possibly her age and her social standing in the community gave her a kind of agency that a lot of these other women didn't have. And so, again, Holt's Claw got comfortable. Here's what he did though, he made an assumption, a racialized, gendered, class-based assumption that if this woman is in this neighborhood, it must be because she's one of these folks who's like these other folks I would be used to assault. So when she went to the police and said this officer sexually assaulted me, it kind of opened up an investigation. They started watching him, seeing where his car was. And then they started knocking on doors. Not asking, right, did the police officer rape you? But there may be some assaults in your area and we're curious to know, or, you know, what have your interactions been? And so women started coming forward. Close to a dozen, I believe, last time I looked to see. Right, so what does this story show? Well, one, you have this officer who is operating along kind of gendered assumptions, making gendered assumptions around like who counts as a good rape victim. Assumptions that kind of intersect with race and with social class and with perceptions about what kinds of people have what kinds of interactions with the police. And at the same time, right, the silver lining here is that the police force in this town in Oklahoma, I can't remember where it was, actually took, you know, the first victims who came forward seriously and proceeded to launch an investigation. So, you know, and that's how this guy has been brought down. And so you know, some of you may kind of have a view that I hate the police or that I don't trust the police, right? What I want is for the police to be held accountable when they behave badly, and I'm glad that in this instance, this officer has been held accountable. But I want, you know, like Dave Chappelle said, I want to be able to call the police too sometimes when I need them, right? I don't want to just be frightened of what my interactions are going to be. And I mean, I think that certainly in the abstract, they serve a useful purpose and a good purpose, and I wouldn't deny that often their jobs are dangerous or thankless. But that doesn't mean we should hold people accountable.
Can you join me in thanking Professor Wilson for